Good evening, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Stuart Charity. I'm the CEO of the AAAA, and on behalf of us all at the association, I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight, and I hope that you're all travelling okay, or as well as can be in these crazy times that we're all living in. The AAAA is committed to supporting you through this crisis with a range of information and services that are specifically designed to help you make informed decisions, to support your employees and your customers, and to come out of the other side of this a stronger business. If you haven't already done so, I'd encourage you to visit our website, aaa.com.au, which has a specific section set up for coronavirus support material. If you have any specific questions around workforce management issues, then contact Emma and her team at Industry Legal Group on 1300 735 306. And a reminder that that service, the ILG service, is free of charge to all AAA members, and I know that those that use it get enormous value out of it. In addition, we're committed to running regular webinars to help provide a more interactive and real-time experience. And I want to thank you for joining us all for the fourth of these webinars tonight. Over the last few weeks, we've been focusing on how to best access the significant level of government financial support available out there to support your business cash flow and to offset some of your operating costs to compensate for the downturn in customer demand that is resulting from the social distancing measures implemented by governments around the country. Those of you that joined us 2 weeks ago would recall that we did a general overview of the various state and federal government assistance available. And last week we did a deep dive into the JobKeeper program, which is a centrepiece of the federal government's COVID-19 assistance to businesses. Tonight, we're going to bring all this together with the assistance of experts from one of Australia's largest major business advisory firms, Grant Thornton Consulting. And we're using real-life case studies that they have undertaken on a number of actual AAA member companies based in different states with different company structures and with different levels of revenue to demonstrate what programs they're eligible for, how much assistance they'll receive, and when they'll receive it. And I'm excited to say that joining me tonight, we have a star-studded lineup of not one, but 3 partners from Grant Thornton. So presenting in the formal section tonight will be Jacky Millership, who's well known to us at the AAA, head of business to government at Grant Thornton and a partner, as well as Peter Parsons, who's a tax partner. A lot of P's there. And joining Jacky and Peter for the Q&A is Paul Banister, who's a partner and head of tax for Grant Thornton, based in Brisbane. So the format of the webinar today is I'll shortly hand over to Jacky and Peter to present, and then we'll finish off with a Q&A session for around 20 minutes at the end, and that will depend on the volume of the questions. But just before I did kick off, I wanted to make a few housekeeping points. First of all, you will get sent a copy of the PowerPoint presentation from tonight, later this week. And if there are any questions that we don't have time to get to tonight, we will try and get to all of them, but if we can't, then we'll send an FAQ with some information with a copy of the presentation, the video of the presentation. So there's no need to write lots of copious notes. You'll get all of that information. Also, again, we've got a large number of attendees on the line tonight, so we're not able to activate the microphones. But that doesn't mean that you can't get involved, and in fact we want you to get involved through asking questions. So if you just want to tell us something generally, use the chat button, but during the Q&A session you'll see, if you move your cursor around, you'll see a Q&A button at the bottom. If you put your questions in there, and then we'll get to those in sequential order as we get to the Q&A session. We'll ask though that there will be quite a bit of material covered in the formal presentations tonight, so maybe wait towards the end of the formal presentations before you start firing questions at us, because you may find that your question is answered in the material. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Jacky Millership to kick off the formal presentation. Jacky.
Thank you. I am just now going to test my technology ability and share screens. If I could just start off by thanking you for the introduction. Yes, Grant Thornton is a global tax, accounting and business advisory firm with about 1,200 staff in Australia and offices in all of the major capital cities. as Stuart said, I lead the business to government team. So what that means is that we're tasked with keeping abreast with all of the ever-changing government grants available at state and federal level, and keeping our clients apprised of those opportunities, and most importantly, helping them access highly competitive discretionary funding. Now, my two colleagues that are joining me, Peter Parsons and Paul Banister, are the tax specialists here. And between them have probably come across every type of company structure, size, and nature of operation, and will be really having the limelight here. I'm really just top and tailing, setting a little bit of context here for this webinar, and coming back to you at the end for a sort of quick word around discretionary grants. So without further ado, I just want to set a little bit of context for this government assistance, this unprecedented government assistance that's now available with coronavirus or COVID-19. So as somebody that's worked in this government grant space for decades, my mantra has always been to companies to think about government assistance in terms of co-funding for projects, and the justification for the government grants is around getting bigger, better or faster results. So better outcomes for Australia or the state sooner. Now, the context that we have now is of course very different, because COVID-19's now, the assistance under COVID-19 is now about sustaining business and retaining workforces. So if you thought government assistance wasn't for you pre-COVID, it's a very different scenario that we're working with now, and you certainly should be reassessing the government assistance available. The other part of context setting that I just wanted to mention is around the complexities that we're facing with unpacking the economic stimulus measures. So there is unprecedented funding, and the complication really comes at two levels. One is that we have every state and territory government having released packages, as well as the federal government. So depending on where you are, but also where you operate, there's complexity getting yourselves around all of those various packages. The second level of complexity here is that we are living in a live legislative environment, which is subject to ongoing development. So even today, my tax partners were busy getting themselves around the very latest developments, and that is, of course, a key challenge for you to stay close to your advisors as this situation evolves. I'm going to ask you to think about the economic stimulus package in terms of 4 funding buckets. I find this is an easier way to understand what it is that is being presented here, another way of slicing and dicing it, if you like. 4 key buckets: cash flow boosting measures, loan facilities, discretionary grants, and the catch-all other bucket. Now, why have I another reason for sort of sticking it into 4 buckets, if you like, these various economic stimulus funding measures, is to also make the point that some of these buckets are designed to help you with immediate assistance, and one of them is to be thought of in a longer term. So the immediate assistance available to you, buckets 1, 2 and 3 as it were, are the cash flow boosting bucket, which has got a whole lot of tax measures, the JobKeeper package, and some small cash flow boosting entitlement grants. Now, entitlements meaning that if you're an eligible company and you can show that your coronavirus impacted, you are entitled to that grant. You don't need to compete for it. The second bucket there being the loans, and the principal one, the SME guarantee scheme, also enabling companies to get access to working capital. And the third bucket, the other, it's a bit of a lazy term for it, I do know, rent relief agreements, funding of apprentices, energy account payment assistance, and the like. So they're really the themes that will be coming through buckets 1, 2, and 3 as Peter works through the case studies. I would like to come back to you at the end just to leave you with some thoughts around bucket 4, the discretionary grants funding bucket, which is there for the longer term measures. Perhaps you could think of those in a way as picking up on further sort of market failures or deeper issues that evolve over time that those immediate measures aren't addressing, and that sort of leaves them with some money up their sleeve to look at these longer term measures that may be required. Now, I know that you have attended a number of webinars and Stuart did just mention those, so I'm absolutely not going to run you through this long list of measures. There's a number of slides, but I did just want to point out that they will be available to you. I understand these slides will be made available. And I just really wanted to give you a nice roundup of all of the measures that you've heard discussed over the prior weeks, a ready resource, if you will, around the key federal measures that are available, as well as those on a state-by-state basis. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Peter Parsons, and just ahead of doing that, just also do a very special thank you to the 3 businesses that kindly gave us their time and stepped through sharing their information with us so that we could build these case studies. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Jackie. Yeah, I echo that sentiment as well. Thank you to those 3 businesses. I'm hoping that the case studies are useful for them, and no one can quite work out who they are, because that's obviously our goal here, the anonymity of that. But with that being said, I want to focus on 3 states. So we're going to look at a case study that deals with some of the stimulus measures in South Australia. And what we've also done as part of that case study is to also include just a notional calculation that really shows the heavy impact and graphically of accessing the cash flow boost at both levels, given that it is a simpler matter of accessing that stimulus measure versus a situation where you obtain the JobKeeper versus not. So if you think about it in the context of, for example, a business that has just over the relevant 30% decline in value versus a business that doesn't quite get there. And when we get to that slide, after I go through the first case study example here, it's quite a stark difference between the two. So it's certainly worth investigating and working towards accessing the JobKeeper scheme if it's available for you. So if I move, Jackie's just is going to control the slides. So we'll keep. So the first slide here is just the case studies I mentioned about South Australia. So just some background facts here. 3 service centre businesses. They're under common ownership, but not groups for tax. They actually operate each of those businesses through a separate company. Turnover is less than the aggregated $50 million. They're subject to South Australian payroll tax. The businesses operate through premises that are leased from related parties within the group. That is, they're not owner-occupied operator businesses. And the subsequent case study I'll go through is the reverse of that, and I'll talk through some of those issues there. Total employees of 14 split across the businesses with wages of less than $4 million. There's 1 apprentice per company or per business, and they were all employed on or before the 1st of March 2020. There's 3 casuals which are utilised across the service centres in varying capacities as needed. So to look at this and at these relevant background facts and what stimulus measures are potentially available, the obvious ones being the JobKeeper payment, the cash flow boost, payroll tax, and then looking at whether or not the apprentice subsidy will be available for this business. And then the combination of really the rent relief and land tax. And I'll draw out just here some of the points through each of those. The first one being in relation to JobKeeper. And one of the key assumptions that I'll make here in this regard is around the satisfaction of either the basic decline in turnover test or the satisfaction of one of the alternate tests that are currently available. Noting, of course, too, that we're still waiting on some level of government feedback in relation to areas like businesses that are operating through a services entity, for example, and how that's actually going to play out, particularly where you may have a larger group that's income tax consolidated, for example, where all the employees are in an entity over to one side, but they're actually servicing the main trading entity within the group. So we're eagerly awaiting information in that regard, and hopefully that comes through in the very near future. But to turn to these particular background facts and just some of the things I wanted to draw out in this regard is, first and foremost, looking at this issue around, all employees being paid all eligible employees being paid $1,500 per fortnight, with top-ups due by the 8th of May 2020. That's obviously one of many key dates, and one that has shifted from, thankfully, a deadline of 30 April, which would have been tomorrow. But in that regard, we're still waiting on some aspects, particularly in relation to this one in all-in concept and how that's going to overall play out as well. So unfortunately here, as you can see, this is a fast evolving feast, and we're not really in a position where we have all the facts at this point, and having some interesting conversations with clients around whether or not they make these top-up payments now where they're unsure as to where that employee is going to fit, or whether they wait until we've got further clarity. One interesting point that has been raised is also just around obtaining your employees' notification that they wish to participate in the scheme. That particular aspect, there is some level of uncertainty as to whether your employees need to notify you by the 30th of June, or whether you actually also get that 8th of May extension. I think if you're in a position at the moment to conservatively obtain that consent and that notification from your employees, and then use the remaining period up to the 8th of May to go about assessing whether or not they are ultimately eligible, and then making any necessary top-up payments might be a reasonable approach. But I think at least until we get through this first section, we're going to end up we're going to end up having to work through that. So moving on from that, just in relation to the casuals, we need to consider that they satisfy both the 12-month employment requirement, as well as being employed on a regular and systematic basis. So in these background facts here, it'd be important to understand how those casuals are employed. Are they employed by one company or by all three at different times, and the impact that may have on that regular and systematic basis. There's also a question too as to whether, if they were employed by one entity, whether or not they may actually fall into the service entity's alternate test when that comes out as well. Question here looking at as well around all the employees must be over the age of 16. So I'll touch on the issues in the next case study around where there are 16 and 17-year-olds that are still at school, and just pointing out as well that 16 years of age requirement is 16 as at the 1st of March 2020. So it's not a person who is currently 15 and turning 16 during this year. It's actually, they must be 16 on the 1st of March 2020. So I'll jump just on the apprentice subsidy here. If we look at that, total employees in the business of 14, so it's less than the requisite 20. So subject to the registration requirements and meeting those, that the apprentice, they'll be eligible for the apprentice subsidy for all three of those apprentices. The cash flow boost here is one of a very positive story for this particular set of facts, given that all three businesses are operated through three different companies with three separate payrolls, one for each. We're actually in a situation here where the cash flow boost is likely to be available to all three entities rather than just one, despite the fact that they're under common control. So just on that basis, that would result potentially in a cash flow boost for these particular facts of between $60,000 and $300,000. And as you'll see in the next structure, where you look at 4 branches within one business, that the outcome can be different there. From a payroll tax perspective, South Australia is offering a 6-month waiver. There's no registration required where you have less than the requisite $4 million in wages. And the period covered by that is from March to August. I'm combining the rent throughout this, the rent relief and the land tax relief, because they tend to go a little bit hand in hand. So in this situation, we've got related party leases of business premises. So I think on that aspect of it, one of the key points to draw out there is that you can actually still access the land tax relief and the rent-free periods even with related parties, and that's extended to self-managed super funds. And I should stress here, I'm not providing any financial advice or legal advice into any of these factors, and this is general advice in nature as well, rather than specific, because we need to go through all the relevant facts. However, subject to satisfying the less than 50 million turnover requirement, the job being eligible for the JobKeeper, and experience a 30% decline in turnover, where a rent-free period is passed on by the landlord of those related parties to the operating businesses, the landlord may well be eligible for a 25% land tax reduction for that particular period. So, Jacky, if I just get you to flick for me to the next slide. So as I mentioned at the outset here, this is just a graphical representation with some with basic employment details for a list of employees within a business. This is not related necessarily to the background facts. However, what it's showing here is a situation where both are eligible for the cash flow boost, but only one is eligible for the JobKeeper payment. And what you can see is, whilst continuing to pay the wages for your employees during this particular period, when you've got roughly the same level of decline in turnover, you can see there's a marked difference between what it is that what you get cash flow wise between getting both of these stimulus measures and only obtaining one. You will note on the blue line as well that there's some cash outflows and some inflows, and some of the interesting part about that is obviously the timing of when you need to pay the wages for the relevant employees versus the time that the various stimulus measures come in. And you can see that's why it's a little bit of a moving feast up and down, and it doesn't really continue to kick upwards until very late in the piece when the last amounts are paid out, and obviously you've paid all those relevant wages. So Jacky, I'll move on to the second case study. So in this situation, we're a relatively similar sized business, but slightly different structure here. This one predominantly Queensland based with one branch in New South Wales. Annual turnover less than 50 million, approximately 15 million in turnover, subject to both Queensland and New South Wales payroll tax on a grouping basis. 40 employees, 29 in Queensland and 11 in New South Wales. 4 apprentices, 3 casual staff, 2 of those are still at school. All casuals and apprentices are paid less than $1,500 per fortnight. But in this situation, 3 of the commercial premises that are operated for the branches are actually owned directly by the company, and they're subject to debt. And I'll have to talk through some of the issues in that regard as well. So back on rather than rehashing everything in relation to JobKeeper, the key areas here, obviously, to look at in these particular facts again, are the details around the top-up payments to ensure that those people eligible for the JobKeeper payment have received that relevant $1,500 per fortnight. The amount needs to be paid in order to meet that relevant payment requirement aspect of the JobKeeper rules. Noting here, as mentioned, that there are 2 children that are listed as still being at school. And looking at the age of those still at school as well is just like I mentioned previously. They must be 16 or over on the 1st of March 2020. But in the situation where they're either 16 or 17 and a full-time student, in order to be eligible now for the JobKeeper payment with those employees, they must be financially independent of their parents in order to be eligible in that regard. In reverse to the last case study, the apprentices here, they won't be eligible for the apprentice subsidy because of the fact that there's greater than 20 employees within the business. But they may be eligible subject to the registration requirements in relation to the reskilling of an out-of-work apprentice subsidy in that regard. There's been, as far as I've been able to see, very limited information around that secondary component. Most people are focused on the less than 20 employees and the subsidy that's far clearer for those that are working with apprentices, as I know many of you are. Cash flow boost here. This is where this is different to the first case study. The interesting part on this one, of course, is that there are actually four different businesses. However, they're all operated through the one company. Unfortunately, as they're operating as a branch, and there's effectively only one withholder from a PAYG perspective, i.e. only one payroll, they're actually only going to be eligible for between 20,000 and 100,000 as though they're just one. As though they're one business, which is, as I've earlier mentioned, is different to the South Australian example that was provided there. From a payroll tax perspective, they have the good fortune or not of being subject to payroll tax in both Queensland and New South Wales on a grouped basis. But from a Queensland perspective, there's a refund available for 2 months, no liability for 3 months, and a deferral for the remainder of the calendar year, where the Australian grouped wages are less than 6.5 million. Now, everyone here that falls into that category from a Queensland perspective should have received an email about the eligibility, or if you go online, you can actually complete, if you didn't get that email, a refund holiday application form. And you can also apply for the deferral for the remaining calendar year online as well. So that's available on the Queensland State Revenue site. Payroll tax in New South Wales, you're still required to lodge your 2019-20 annual rec by the due date. This is the methodology that they'll be operating under in order to determine the 25% waiver off the annual liability. From just noting that from the 1st of July 2020 as well, that the threshold in New South Wales for payroll tax increases from $900,000 to $1 million, and also slightly different to Queensland here for the waiver requirements is that it's based on Australian grouped wages of less than $10 million, and there's the 25% reduction plus a 3-month deferral in New South Wales that's offered. Now, moving on quickly to the rent relief and the land tax relief here. As I mentioned previously, there's limited access here because what we've got at 3 of the sites is an owner-occupied operator. And unfortunately, you are unable to grant rent relief to yourself, meaning that the requirements in relation to obtaining land tax relief, being that the landlord provides a rent-free period to the relevant tenant, can't be met in these circumstances. Now, there's one site obviously that is operated from an independent landlord, in which case there could be the ability to seek relief there, and that particular landlord may then also have access to land tax relief in that regard. Now, this issue in particular has been raised by the Property Council of Australia with the government, just purely because it seems a little bit out of step with the fact that related parties with a structure where these properties are separated has a markedly different outcome to those that are operating within the same business, despite the fact that they all meet the same decline in turnover requirements. Really only in this situation for those commercial premises is the opportunity to approach the bank for a 6-month deferral on loan repayments. That's something that can be negotiated there, but as any astute person will see there, that is only a deferral as opposed to the offers of rent-free and land tax relief. So it's nowhere near as beneficial in that regard. Also too, raising the SME guarantee loans that may be eligible and applications through the bank for the $250,000, but that being focused around providing working capital resources can't be used to renegotiate existing loans or equipment finance arrangements. It needs to be to fund working capital within the business. Jacky, would you mind just shifting over to case study 3? Thank you. So the final case study here is to look sole trader business in country New South Wales with 4 employees, including spouse. A spouse receives $700 a fortnight, and the business is operated through leased premises, turnover of less than $2 million, no payroll tax, and no apprentices in this particular business. So JobKeeper, obviously, again, subject to all the same requirements for an eligibility perspective. Clearly here we have a JobKeeper top-up payment required for the spouse. But also here, given that this is a sole trader business, there is also consideration required for an entitlement to the business participation eligibility. So the sole trader, who not being an employee, may be the one person who is eligible for the business participation aspect to get in here, where there's no wages condition attached. The issue there is, of course, if for example this was a partnership, only one of the partners can be nominated for that business participation inclusion in the JobKeeper payment. So that's something to watch out for, depending on the structures of groups and businesses throughout. So also too, just to consider this, an issue that may arise if the sole trader were also to take on a part-time role as an employee somewhere else after the 1st of March 2020. So if they were to take on that position, they may actually no longer be eligible for the JobKeeper payment under the business participation concession, but also they won't be eligible for the JobKeeper payment in relation to this new employer because of the fact that they weren't employed in that part-time capacity on or before the 1st of March 2020. As with the other 2 case studies, they'll be eligible for the cash flow boost. It's somewhere between the $20,000 and $100,000. Here, given that there's no relationship between the tenant and the landlord, is the potential to negotiate some rent relief with the landlord based on leasing principles in the National Code of Conduct. And also here, there's also the ability to apply for that same SME guarantee working capital funding through the banks as well. So I think I've managed to stick relatively well to time on going through those. Obviously, there's a fair bit of content covered in here, and hopefully it's either sparks some additional questions that we can go through in the Q&A, or it's covered off on some of those queries that people have had. As I've mentioned, it really is at this stage very much an evolving feast, particularly in relation to this JobKeeper scheme and how that's going to play out. And talking to people, that exercising some level of caution and taking advantage of the extensions as they're granted, but then also being mindful of some of the things that are floating around. I heard that potentially a different industry for AAA, but casuals, for example, in the education sector. So casual teachers that potentially are on the casual books, but only work, say, for one term, are unlikely to satisfy the relevant requirements in relation to the regular and systematic basis of employment from a casual basis. So there are some things to watch out for when you're having a look at the basis by which you've got your 12-month casuals. So Jacky, I'll hand back over to you for the roundup in that regard.
Thank you very much. So I did just want to finish up on a few things, including just a word around discretionary grants, really for you to put into the back of your mind for later on, as it were. I just want to draw, first of all, the contrast between discretionary grants and entitlement grants. So one of the things that I mentioned when we were looking at the buckets for the economic measures were small entitlement grants, where literally if companies can show that they're eligible, that they have suffered economically as a result of coronavirus, they are entitled to a grant. What we have in the discretionary grants bucket here are an opportunity for companies, or indeed industry associations on behalf of clusters of companies or groups of companies, to put forward a pitch to have some funding applied to them in a competitive environment. So each of our state governments has set aside up to $1 billion in these discretionary grants. Exactly how they're going to be applied is not really very clear at this point in time, and my reading of that situation is that the government's really waiting to see what the immediate measures can't fix, and therefore where this discretionary grant funding should be applied to sort of address any market failures or indeed just unforeseen impact that particular sectors need further measures to address. The government departments that I'm in contact with as part of my job, they're clearly being overwhelmed with inquiries. They're sending people away and directing them to talk to their industry association as the best conduit to put forward these pitches. So what I'd like to ask you to think about is that as you move through this coronavirus dip, or more importantly, a longer sustained economic dip, which I think we're going to see on the back of coronavirus, it measures itself being eased up and playing out, but that longer economic dip that we're likely to experience here, that you start to think about, is there a need for government to step in and address something that's particular to your industry sector? And really the best way for you to start thinking about that is to have a look at your scenario planning. We advise everyone to do scenario planning just for your own cash management and business management point of view. But what I'm saying here is I would encourage you to share your scenario planning with your industry group, so that the AAA can not only understand what it means for your business and your sector, but also so they can start to get some feeling for the upstream and downstream impacts, so that when it comes for potentially for AAA to be talking to government further down the track, and they're lobbying for some additional assistance, that they're able to put forward the case as to why the government should be doing that, where they should be applying their dollar to get the best bang for buck, as it were. So that's just something I wanted to leave you to think about, to close off on those billions of dollars that are flying around as part of the economic stimulus measures. And look, just before we do move to the Q&A session now, I just wanted to draw your attention to a number of resources that we'd be delighted to share with you. They're available on our website, and I'll give you a link for that on the next screen. But the first of those that I wanted to point out is our resilience wheel tool. Now, I'm sure you can't read that terribly tiny text, or for the reading impaired like myself anyway, that's an awfully difficult thing to do. But this is basically a series of questions that will lead you through doing some of that cash flow planning, contingency planning, stakeholder management, management of communications with your people, and looking after their safety, and setting up a crisis management team should that be required. The website address, so that's just our homepage, grantthornton.com.au. If you do go there, you will see on our very front page, there's a responding to the coronavirus link with that red button, find out more. And there is a wealth of information. So the resilience wheel, as I just mentioned, but a stimulus matrix brochure there that's constantly being updated, as well as a list of discretionary government grants and all sorts of other tools. So I just wanted to encourage you to make good use of those. And I think we are ready now to ask Paul and Peter to come back online, and I'll hand over to Stuart to talk to us around what questions have come through.
Righty, thanks very much, Jackie and Peter. I think what that demonstrates is a couple of things, and I think you've done it very well. But the situation at the moment, all of these government assistance programs are significant, and probably will, with some businesses, be the difference between them coming through this crisis and not. But it is very complex. And what we have now is some of the almost experts in Australia on this. It is a moving feast, but now's your opportunity to ask questions. So as I said at the outset, if you move your cursor, you'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Just start typing in your questions, and we'll put those to the panel to answer. We've got about just under 20 minutes, so we'll start to kick off. We have had a few questions through. So the first one, there's actually two questions that relate to the eligibility requirements around students. So do university-age students who work part-time around their studies need to be independent? Peter, I might throw that one to you.
Yeah, sure. So obviously on that the financially independent thing for full-time students, just I'll touch on the definition of that, which we don't have yet. This was one of the announcements made last Friday, so we're still waiting on clarification as to what that definition is. The question around university-age students, I mean, it talks about full-time students. So from my perspective, to the extent that they're 16 or 17 and at university and still living at home and satisfy the requirement of being financially, not being financially independent, that they will be ineligible for JobKeeper payment. But that, again, unfortunately, is subject to whatever those definitions are that relate to that. But I imagine, and I'm happy to be corrected, that there will be less people, less students that are at university in this regard than are at high school, having high school jobs when we're looking at it from a JobKeeper perspective.
No problems. The next one relates to variations in business size between last year and this year from a comparison point of view. So businesses added employees and increased, obviously, overheads. That resulted in a 20% increase in turnover in the first quarter of this year compared to last year. They've seen a decrease of 12% in April, but and it seems to be steady at that. So they're saying that it's a drop off of 30% in this year's current turnover, but only 12% compared to last year. So Peter, again, maybe yourself or Paul, this will probably go into the alternative test, I would have thought.
Yeah, this is one that I'm very passionate about, actually, because a lot of the businesses that I tend to work with are highly scalable businesses. So this was actually something that before these alternate tests came out, Paul will attest to, that I was jumping up and down about for quite a period, that it needed to be factored in that the business 12 months ago, in a lot of cases, is not the same business today, and particularly as has been indicated here in this question. Is about that fact that this business has grown. It's not the same business. They've had to increase capacity and the ability to have greater turnover. But then, a substantial drop that doesn't compare to last year absolutely falls into that turnover requirement. So that's covered in the Commissioner's Rule number 9. If 12.5% or more in 3 months, then you use the last 3 months as a base, and you compare the average of that to April in order to determine whether or not you've had the requisite 30% decline in that regard. I've said that really fast, which makes it sound completely simple, but working through that and obviously overlaying that along with the modified GST turnover rules, working through the projected GST turnover requirements, a lot of those issues need to also be factored into that. It's not just a case of looking here at what was my turnover. You've got to go through the process, either internally or with your advisors, at looking at how that factors in on a modified GST turnover basis.
I just might add in there that this is really 3 tests in one, because not everyone just has a 3-month jump. So it's like 50% increase over 12 months. You're into this alternative 25 out of 6 months, 12.5 out of 3 months. So, but in each case, what you do is you compare against the 3 months prior to the test period. So if you're testing in April, you hope that you've had a good first quarter as a benchmark to measure against.
Thank you very much. Next question: how is the government inputs going to impact on our P&L and tax responsibilities?
Yeah, so one of the areas I didn't touch on here as far as tax responsibilities and the inputs is also to talking about the instant asset write-off and the accelerated depreciation measures too. I know you've touched on those, Stuart, in some of the previous webinars that have been on. So I didn't focus too heavily on those tonight. We'll focus more on the income measures. So there's obviously tax consequences of when you can write off from a capital deduction point of view, from a depreciation perspective, but specifically in relation to JobKeeper payments and the cash flow boost. The cash flow boosts are fantastically non-assessable, non-exempt, so there's no tax obligations in relation to what you receive on those. However, the JobKeeper payment is different in that regard. It is actually included as income, and it effectively offsets the salary and wages. So you end up in a neutral position. Effectively, the government provides the subsidy of the $1,500. The employer makes the payment. They don't get a net benefit from that aspect. It's the employees who are actually benefiting in that regard.
Thank you very much. I think that answers another question about the cash flow first payment. Is it taxable? That's not.
It is not. And it's, so, and to be honest, our experience that we've had, and I don't know how many people on the webinar tonight, what their experiences have been, but we've certainly seen that the ATO has been very proactive in applying the cash flow boosts to taxpayers when they lodge their returns, but obviously just be mindful of making sure that the calculation methodology adopted is correct, and that you notify the ATO if you feel like it has been calculated rightly or wrongly. And one of the other areas on all of these stimulus measures too is, whilst we talked about 2 differing circumstances from in those case studies, is just to remember that there are some specific anti-avoidance rules that are embedded in these particular stimulus measures. So going about trying to restructure to take advantage of these rules and access a larger cash flow boost than you would ordinarily have been entitled to is certainly likely to to be subject to review and scrutiny and potential issues down the track. Similarly to making sure that you've got a basis for your projected GST turnover in accordance with the legislation as well, working down those paths and making sure you're not availing yourself of these stimulus measures when you're not otherwise entitled.
Righty, not quite sure what the question is here, but where the landlord is a related entity, reducing the rent received will reduce landlord profit.
Absolutely, it will, and that's what that was a discussion that I actually had with someone this morning. Was that you've got to question the overall situation here and why you're set up in a structure in that way in the first instance. But that being said, there may come a time where the circumstances are dire enough for the business that you are the business and you are the landlord in that situation. You may need to make a decision in that regard. And remember, to the extent too that you do provide a rent-free period, and the landlord is then entitled to a land tax, to some form of land tax relief in their relevant state. That's a third-party relief item that would otherwise be payable. So to some extent, I agree, you are reducing your turnover there, but to the extent that it's neutral because of the land tax relief provided by the relevant state jurisdiction, that there's some consideration there. Equally so, I say that I agree that people should consider it from a holistic perspective, particularly to, even though the Commissioner said they're not going to take action for self-managed super funds providing, a temporary rent-free period, just making sure that you do get advice on that before you make an assessment to just go ahead and do that for a period of time. I think talking through that and thinking about the other factors is absolutely relevant there, and it's equally so to other structures where you're holding the property in say, a discretionary trust.
Thank you. This one's from Anthony Dack, who's who we know Anthony well, beautiful downtown Bega. And he's actually travelling pretty well at the moment. They're going okay. They've got 4 employees. He's asking, should they register for JobKeeper now or wait until they actually need to?
Look, I think on that one, it's a question of probably looking and making sure definitely that you are not eligible at this particular point, for the April period. It makes sense to keep monitoring that and working out what it looks like. I don't think there's no immediate obligation to register now. The main deadline here that we're looking at is largely in relation to accessing the April payments. So if you don't make the relevant top-ups at that particular point in time, and in this situation, if the 4 employees are already over the $1,500 a fortnight, for example, they would already satisfy the payment requirement. It's really just a question as to whether or not the employees want to be part of the scheme, and then they can fill in those nomination forms if required, given the 4 of them there, and then leave it for the employer to make the relevant assessment. And I think it then just means you can move quite quickly when we're going to have a shorter time frame. I'll let Paul maybe comment on that as well.
Yeah, I think the important thing to be aware of after the first period, which is this stage, the 8th of May, when all the latitude for the first 3 fortnights finishes in terms of catch-up payments, and then registration, or should I say enrolment is the term they're using, by 31 May. So as soon as we're through that, then you've got sort of a month-by-month proposition from there. So you need to be sort of on top of whether or not you're going to qualify sort of during the month, and the time frames become quite tight. So it's good to be ready, Anthony, ready to go, but there's no need to register right now. Just keep watch, and if you start looking like you're going to experience the decline, get the advice at the time.
Thanks, guys. Are all directors who are taking a weekly wage eligible for JobKeeper? Good question.
So I'll take that, Pete, if you like. If a director is actually an employee as such and remunerated, so they're an executive director, then they're fine. They're eligible for JobKeeper. If they're just being paid some remuneration for their role as a director, but they're not necessarily an employee in the normal sense, it starts getting complicated. This is because a a director, and we're getting a little bit technical here, but a director is an officer of the company as opposed to being an employee in their traditional role as director. So it's not going to be in all situations that a director will be eligible. At a practical level, I actually don't think the ATO is going to notice and push it too much if they're just one of a number of people that is qualifying for JobKeeper and there's a regular payment going out to them. At the other end, though, is for, and I think it's worth just commenting here, a director of a company may also qualify for what they call the business participation qualification. So if you've got a director that is not receiving any wage and they have no other permanent role in another company, another business, so they're not a permanent part-time or permanent full-time, casual's okay, even if it's long-term casual, then you may be able to nominate a director as being subject to the JobKeeper, or the director can nominate, and the company will qualify as JobKeeper under that.
Thank you. Next question from Jane, just dropped off my screen. It appears we're required to report monthly turnover to the ATO. Would it be that JobKeeper could be denied if turnover is recovering, even though the employer has paid JobKeeper to employees in good faith? So meeting the criteria now for the current month, but not sure into the future should an employee take a leap of faith and start paying their employees or wait off.
So excellent question on that. So the first part about it is, I would say right at this moment we've got till the 8th of May to actually assess the top-up payments and eligibility for April. So I would say that the first answer is, and this is the good news, if you satisfy the basic decline in turnover for the period in relation to April, you don't have to continue to satisfy the requirement for the remainder of the scheme. So you only need to satisfy it once in order to be eligible. You still need to report your relevant turnovers, but that is more in relation to meeting your obligations in relation to GST. So you continue to report as normal, but you're not assessed again as to your eligibility for the JobKeeper payment once you've satisfied the requirements.
No problems. There's a similar question later on about qualifying in May. You have to qualifying in April. Do you have to re-qualify in May and so on? You only have to qualify once.
No, you don't. That's right. And sorry, Paul, I was just going to say, if you don't qualify in April, you can reassess in May. And if you qualify in May, you don't have to then qualify in June, July, August and September.
Yeah, Stuart, I was just going to add, one of the things that is coming up a little bit now as people start learning more detail about the rules is whether they've computed their decline properly. And that might be, they might have did it 2 weeks ago, applied, and they found that the estimates they did might have been wrong. They got concerned about that. Sometimes it might be they did made a computation error measuring, say, a year ago's turnover or this year's turnover. You know, I think if things are validly, going to the projection example, if the circumstances that you were aware of at the time supported the estimate made, even if the estimate was wrong, then the Commissioner is going to issue a statement on this, as he's going to exercise some tolerance over that. So I think it should be, it's not going to be like your normal tax compliance is what we've been told. It's, you know, the Treasurer has said this is a spending scheme to stimulate, and it needs to be administered as such rather than just a normal tax law.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, so I might just do one more question. So this is someone that's had a double whammy. Our business was also affected by bushfires, so it's down on the previous 3 months also. How can we check out eligibility?
Just a question on, oh, sorry, Peter, I was just, yeah. If you have the alternate tests applying, any of the alternate tests, there are specific rules there as to how you pick the period, and that's whether it's bushfire affected or drought affected. So if you're one of the affected postcodes that's subject to the deferral of payment and lodgement, then there'll be a different selection there. However, and the lights have just been switched off in my office here. However, if it's just a matter of your basic test, so you compare with your month or quarter a year ago, then there isn't any specific rule.
No problems. Well, thank you all, panel. So just before I closed off this webinar tonight, I just wanted to talk on a future topic that we've got coming down the pipeline. Over the last week, we did a fair bit of consultation out to our board, out to our Automotive Repair Council Committee and to others. What came through loud and clear was that really what we're trying to do is get a read on what's going on out there in the market. And what we found is things are a bit patchy. I think regional areas seem to be going better than the metropolitan areas. But one of the major things that came through very strongly was that there is, or one of the major impacts on the drop of demand for getting car servicing and therefore car parts was consumer confusion about whether we're actually still open for business. And you can understand this because we've got this conflicting message that's going out with governments telling people to only travel around a fairly tight definition of essential activities. But on the other hand, they're telling us to stay open as an industry because we're an essential service. We keep other industries moving. But what we also found was that businesses that implemented safe hygiene practices, and the majority of workshops out there have done that, which is fantastic. And the ones that have combined that with proactively making contact with their customers and assuring them that they are open and doing that in a very constructive way, they're being far less impacted by COVID-19 restrictions than those that haven't. And we've got anecdotal evidence of businesses that have gone on a campaign, SMS'd all their customers to let them know they're open, and they've gone from having 1 or 2 forward bookings to having 3 weeks of forward bookings. So that leads us to believe that there is a significant issue out there around communicating to customers that we are open. So as a result, the AAAA is working on a range of communication materials, key messaging and tips that repairers can use to remind car owners that we're here to support them, as well as highlighting the importance of regular vehicle maintenance, the safety, reliability, maintaining warranty and resale value on your car. So keep an eye out on some materials that will be coming out over the next week or so on that to help you communicate with your customers. But also we're going to do a webinar on that in the next few weeks. So we will mix things up. We've done a number of webinars now on government assistance. We're now going to mix up the topics a bit, and that will be one. So just in closing, I'd really like to thank Jacky, Peter and Paul for participating in this webinar tonight to help us get a really more deeper understanding of the eligibility requirements around different programs and using some case studies of AAA member businesses to help illustrate that. I will say that Grant Thornton you guys have donated your time and expertise free of charge tonight, and also undertaken the case studies free of charge. So we are so grateful that you've stepped up to help our association and our members at a time of need. So thank you very much, guys, for what you do for us and for your contribution tonight. And for everyone out there, thank you for joining our webinar tonight and for your ongoing support of the AAAA. Look, there's no guarantees here, but we are starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel with governments talking about the fact that they may start slowly lifting some of the restrictions if the current levels of infection stay as low as they are. And I think that combined with some financial assistance and some other marketing assistance that we're going to give you over the next couple of weeks, as well as the fact that these payments from government are starting to flow. The cash flow boost is starting to flow, the JobKeeper will start to flow, and all of that combined, I think, will start to help us through this crisis. I'll also say that I am very optimistic that our industry will bounce back strongly on the other side of this crisis. People can only defer a car service for so long, We've seen over the last 2 years, and it's certainly been accentuated in the last couple of months, a big drop off in new car sales. And that means that people are holding on to their older cars longer. So those cars are more likely to be in our sweet spot from a service and accessory point of view. And even though governments are starting to remove some of those restrictions, we do think some border restrictions, and particularly international border restrictions, may remain in place for some time. And hopefully that will result in Australians rediscovering touring and tourism in Australia and by car in a lot of cases. And that's all, again, good for our industry. So, you know, whilst we are going through a very, very difficult time, and I know it's a challenging time for us all as business owners, there is things to be optimistic about. We do just need to get over the next few months. So please stay strong. Look after your mental health and that of your employees and your family. Let's watch out for each other and support each other through these unprecedented times. And just know that there is significant support out there for you, both from a government point of view and from a AAA point of view. We really want to see all of you businesses come through this and our industry come out on the other side stronger than ever and more resilient than ever. So thank you very much. Thank you again to the Grant Thornton team for your contribution tonight, and wish you all a great night. Thank you very much.